The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus argues that death is not a bad thing and not something that we should fear.
Right on.
But in an influential paper from 1970, the American philosopher Thomas Nagel argues that death is intrinsically bad.
What?
He says that having a life is intrinsically good, and death is something that deprives us of life. And so, as a deprivation of the good of life, death is intrinsically bad. What do you think of that argument, Scully?
I think that life is a deprivation of death.
Thomas Nagel's 1970 paper, Death, is one of the most influential papers on the topic of death in the analytic tradition of philosophy. This is sort of the Anglo-American tradition of philosophy in the last 100 years. And Nagel's paper is important in particular for articulating what's come to be known as a deprivation account of the badness of death. So Nagel thinks that it's bad to die, or rather it's bad to be dead. But there's a problem that we've already looked at that's presented originally by Epicurus with the idea of saying that death is a bad thing because I'm not around when I'm dead. So how could it possibly be bad for me? There's no me there to suffer the badness of my death. And Nagel's argument is to say that death is bad, you might say, in contrast to the alternatives. You know, if I were to die next year, that would be a worse way to spend next year than spending next year alive. That what it would mean for me to die next year is that I would be deprived of all those future years that I might otherwise have been able to live out. And so the thought with Nagel's argument is when we want to consider the goodness or badness of something happening, we don't want to just consider that thing in its own right, but we want to consider it in contrast with the alternatives. And in particular, while I might not be around when I'm dead to think, gosh, it's too bad I'm dead, I can, while I'm alive, think, well, if I'm given the choice between being alive next year and being dead next year, I would prefer to be alive next year. So in that sense, there's a contrasting case in contrast with which my death would be a bad thing. And in that sense, death counts as a deprivation of life. Now, Nagel recognizes that for his argument to be compelling, he needs to be able to address and respond to arguments from Epicurus and from Lucretius to the effect that death is not a bad thing. And he offers three possible objections from the Epicurean position that he thinks he has answers to. The first is a basic premise of the Epicurean argument, which is that the only things that can be good or bad for me are those things that I experience. So the thought then for Epicurus is, I don't experience being dead, so dead can't be bad for me. And Nagel says, look, there's a whole bunch of things that can be bad for you even though you don't experience them. Imagine having people make fun of you behind your back, or imagine your partner is cheating on you behind your back. You might be blissfully unaware that this is going on, but nevertheless is bad for you. Now, one possible Epicurean reply would be to say, nothing's going wrong in your life while you're being cheated on because you don't know it's happening. It's only when you find out that you start to experience misfortune. And Nagel's point, I think, is a reasonable one, where he says, the reason it hurts to find out you've been cheated on is because it's bad to be cheated on. If it weren't bad to be cheated on, it wouldn't hurt to find out. And so the thought there is that the bad thing is already happening before you find out. You might add, actually, and he doesn't say this, but if it were the case that it's the finding out that's bad rather than the being cheated on that's bad, when your friend tells you that your partner is cheating on you, you should rightly be angry at the friend who told you, who made you unhappy, rather than at the partner who was cheating on you. But that doesn't seem to be right. It does seem that we're upset about the thing that was happening rather than the finding out that happened. So that's the first objection. The second objection he considers is the thought that one difference between being cheated on or ridiculed on the one hand and being dead on the other is that there's still a me who is being cheated on or being ridiculed, but when I'm dead, there's no me. So I can't be worse off because there's no me around to suffer the misfortune. And here he gives the example of an intelligent person who suffers a catastrophic brain injury and was reduced to the mental state of a contented infant. So this person, according to the hypothesis, is happy, they're cheerful, they're not having any bad experiences, they're sort of cooing like a baby in their hospital bed. But nevertheless, it seems like it's right to say that the person has experienced a great misfortune, even though in some sense that person is no longer there. The person who I used to engage in all sorts of lively conversations about art and culture and politics is in some sense effectively gone. But nevertheless, there is this person in the hospital bed cooing like an infant, and I can think he has suffered or she has suffered some great misfortune. So in some sense, I can say that something bad has happened to somebody, even though to all intents and purposes, that person is gone. And then the third argument he wants to address is the symmetry argument from Lucretius. So Lucretius says, look, you don't feel any kind of fear and horror about the period of non-existence before you were born. So why do you feel any fear and horror about the period of non-existence after you're dead? And Nagel says there's an important asymmetry here, that I could reasonably wish that I could have more life beyond whatever allotted years I'm going to get. I could wish that my life could be extended in the future direction, but he thinks that it makes less sense to wish that my life could be extended in the past direction, to wish that I could have been born sooner. And his reason for saying that is that if I had been born sooner, it wouldn't in some sense be me who was born. If I had been born in the 1920s, same genetic makeup, all the rest, same person to some extent, I would have been born into a different world. I would have a different set of experiences. In some sense, it wouldn't be me who would be getting more life. Now, this argument raises, I think, some thorny issues in the philosophy of personal identity, and I'm not going to get into them in this short video, but it does raise some interesting questions about what exactly makes me me in a way that would make my being born earlier or later the life of somebody else rather than me. Now, there's a central premise to Nagel's argument in his deprivation account, which is that having a life is good. So he wants to say that, life has its ups and downs, its good experiences, its bad experiences. But in addition to that, there is the fact of having a life. And having a life is itself a good thing. Such a good thing that even if most of your experiences are bad, being alive is a net positive because having a life outweighs all the bad experiences within it. And he doesn't offer that much in the way of an argument for this premise. He says a few things about how it's good to be able to have experiences and all of the rest. But I think there's a reasonable question to ask whether having a life, as distinct from all the experiences within a life, can itself be a good thing. And in particular, I think there's two contrasting positions you could take here. You could say that having a life is a neutral matter. It's the experiences that count. So I think this is roughly the Epicurean position, where they want to say good experiences are good, bad experiences are bad, but they don't place any particular weight on the simple fact of having a life, whereas Nagel wants to say that having a life is a good thing. The other position you could take is a pessimistic one, and I think this is maybe most famously represented by the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who wants to say that having a life is a net negative, that is bad, that life is conditioned by suffering, and it's shaped by the volition that we have, the force of will that drives us constantly to strive and to want things in a way that causes suffering for ourselves and others. He takes himself to be drawing significantly on Indian and Buddhist philosophy here. It's unclear to what extent this accurately represents the Indian philosophical traditions. Schopenhauer was writing in the early 19th century when scholarship in Europe on Indian philosophy was a little thin. But there's at least an argument there to be entertained that, contrary to Nagel's point that having a life is a net positive, someone like Schopenhauer might say that having a life is a net negative. And one thing Schopenhauer shares with Buddhist philosophy is the idea that the goal of life is not to achieve things, but rather to achieve the extinction of the will, to get to a point where you are no longer driven by your will. Now, there's a question that Nagel raises right at the end of his paper. So he's arguing on the whole that life is a good thing, so the deprivation of life is a bad thing. And then he asks, is this always the case? So he contrasts the poet John Keats, who died at the age of 26, with the novelist Leo Tolstoy, who lived to be 82. And he says, it seems intuitive to say that Keats's death was more of a tragedy than Tolstoy's, that Keats somehow was deprived of more than Tolstoy was. And so then there's a question that, it seems natural to say that there's something bad, there's something sad about somebody dying young. Think of all the years that Keats missed out on. Think of all the great poetry we missed out on. Whereas, Tolstoy lived to a ripe old age. He had a lot of great achievements. It's not like there was like some further great novel in the offing that might have come about. Maybe there was, I don't know. But we somehow think of it as less of a tragedy. So then there's a question of, is it nevertheless a deprivation for Tolstoy to have died when he did? And Nagel ultimately comes down on the side of yes, that it is a deprivation. And not only is it too bad for Tolstoy, But as long as we're alive, as long as being alive, having a life is a good thing, being deprived of more life is a bad thing. And there are obviously exceptional cases where somebody's life is so bad that they would choose to end it. And there's a whole philosophical debate around the ethics of euthanasia. But for the most part, even very old people have reason to want to go on living. And so, according to Nagel, it is a deprivation of life and a bad thing no matter how old you are. And so he gets to the point of saying that if this is the case, if it's the case that no matter when you die, you're being deprived of more life, and so your death is a bad thing, he says, in that case, a bad end awaits all of us. If you liked this video or found it useful, please do give it a thumbs up on YouTube.
I don't have any thumbs.
Or alternatively, or additionally, maybe you could follow this YouTube channel. I appreciate all the likes and all the follows. Thank you.